Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to America's worst mountaineering disaster, 1967 Mount Denali disaster. I have absolutely no idea about this disaster. I've never heard of it before. I just know when it comes to like people who are climbing mountains and stuff, there are definitely horror stories that you wouldn't want to be a part of. Like, I'm just thinking people that are trying to climb Everest, and I swear there's like loads of dead bodies on the way to the summit of Everest because the conditions are so extreme. So I mean, I'm just gonna assume it's something like that. But when you're hearing mountaineering disaster, it's not gonna be good. I just don't know what this specific one is. So we're gonna check this out. Obviously, this is the biggest mountain in the US, and it's in Alaska, and we're just gonna learn about it. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully, going to enjoy. And yeah, links also in the description to my Patreon, where you can see reactions that I can't post to YouTube. But let's check this out and learn a bit about this, I guess, horror story.
Mount Denali, standing at 20,310 feet or 6,190 meters. Mount Denali is the highest point in North America. Compared to some of the other great mountains on Earth though, Denali doesn't seem particularly impressive, at least at first glance. But due to a combination of remoteness, weather, latitude, and vertical distance need to be traveled, Denali is a legendary challenge. For these reasons, the success rate of summit hopefuls is less than that of even the world's highest mountain, Mount Everest.
What the hell?
Certainly, what would a legendary mountain be without a horrifying incident? This is the 1967 Mount Denali disaster.
Here we go.
Today's video is brought to you by Babbel, one of the top language learning apps.
Come on, secure that bag. You love to see it. I mean, this is an old video, so I assume that ad still isn't in play, but
The 7 summits are the highest points or mountains on each of the 7 continents.
so you're gonna have Kilimanjaro. You're gonna have Mount Everest. That's 2. Denali. There'll be one in the Andes Mountains. I don't know what it will be called. I guess one in the Alps for Europe. I don't know what it will be called. God damn it. So there's 3. And South America, the Andes. North America, Denali. Asia, you've got... Wait, what have I said? Kilimanjaro, Africa. Mount Everest, Asia. So yeah, it's just Europe, Oceania actually. I don't know what Oceania will be.
Everest is Asia's highest and also the highest on Earth. Aconcagua is South America's, Elbrus is Europe's, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so this is not even in the Alps. This is in Turkey or Russia.
Mount Denali is North America's highest point, and although it's part of this exclusive 7 Summits club among the world's highest peaks, Denali isn't particularly impressive, at least in terms of elevation. Any one of the 14 8,000 meter peaks is almost a quarter higher. Aconcagua in South America is higher, and so are many others in Asia that are only not talked about because they're overshadowed by the other giants of the region. But elevation alone isn't the full picture. Summit elevation is deceptive. It's only one of several characteristics which can drastically alter the difficulty of a climb. The first thing to note is that elevation is the height of a mountain from sea level, not from the surrounding area. If a mountain sits on a 10,000 foot plateau and then only rises 5,000 feet up from there, the visual appearance won't be nearly as impressive. So another way to measure mountains to get a true scale for the distance needed to summit is by measuring...
How are you climbing this one? This one looks steeper than anything.
...from the base of the mountain to the peak. It's pretty simple, you're just measuring the actual mountain itself rather than the mountain plus the ground it sits on. And incredibly, by this measure, and therefore the vertical distance mountaineers need to cover to summit the mountain, Denali is the tallest from base to peak. This means that although it's only 20,000 feet compared to Everest's 29,000 feet, the climbable portion of Denali is actually larger. The base of Everest sits at around 17,000 feet and then rises to 29,000 feet from there, whereas the base of Denali starts at around 2,000 feet above sea level, but then rises to over 20,000. Depending on where exactly the measurement is taken, climbers need to travel around 2.5 vertical miles to reach the top of Everest, but 3.5 vertical miles to reach the top of Denali. Put another way, if Denali sat on the same plateau as Everest, it would be almost 5,000 feet taller. And even more incredibly, that's far from everything that makes Denali a unique challenge.
So what we're learning here is Everest is a fraud and Denali is the big dog. I'm joking, but that picture of Denali, by the way, like, because I feel like Mount Everest is obviously in mountain ranges where there's so many mountains around, and it's just the biggest out of the bunch, right? This one, like Denali, seems to just stand out so much more, which is so much more impressive. But I mean, I wouldn't want to climb either, to be honest. I'm good just staying in my home. I'm not saying I would find Everest easier, because god damn it, it's probably the hardest thing anyone can do. But it's fascinating to learn that Denali's actually like, it's a lot more comparable than maybe like off first glance or whatever.
Challenge. At just 24 years old in 1966, Joe Wilcox had made over 50 ascents of mountains 10,000 feet or higher all across the United States. With such an impressive resume at such an early age, he started to think about what his next big climb might be. That year, he worked as a tree cutter on some of the coastal Alaskan islands near the Alaskan Panhandle, and slowly his attention turned north toward the most impressive peak on the continent. Over the course of the year, the idea grew until eventually he made up his mind and began recruiting for his attempt at Mount Denali. As a quick note, at the time it was known as Mount McKinley, but was later changed back to the name Denali, which was the native name it had had for hundreds of years.
Right.
In any case, Joe began by recruiting some of the mountaineers he knew, Jerry Clark and Mark McLaughlin. Jared then took over some of the recruiting process because he was older and much more entrenched in the climbing scene and knew more people who might be interested. So then while Jerry handled the people, Joe worked on the technical details of the climb. Eventually, he came up with a cost of $300 per person, or around $2,000 in today's value, to cover the cost of food, gear, and transportation from Seattle to Alaska. Joe and Jerry then sent out a newsletter to over a dozen climbers who might be interested. In it was a full itinerary, training recommendations, and reading materials like books on avalanches and glacier travel safety. Ultimately, of those who received the letter, 6 more signed on, bringing the group to a total of 9, including the 3 original members. From there, they sent in an application to the Alaskan branch of the National Park Service, which is required by anyone looking to summit. This would be the first stumbling block for the group. Through conversation, the National Park Service realized that although the members of the group had basic mountaineering skills, none of them had experience above 15,000 feet. And because about a quarter of Denali is above that height, this would mean that they were entirely unprepared for the altitude sickness that can set in as you ascend. Because of this, park rangers recommended that they try to join with another group from Colorado who planned to make an attempt at around the same time. Joe and this group would end up speaking briefly and agreed to cooperate, but still climb independently. This was still too much of a concern for the park rangers, who were hesitant to accept their application as it was. Then, both luckily and unluckily, a member of the more experienced group was in a car accident where he broke his hand and arm. This meant that he was no longer able to participate, and their group was now 1 short of the minimum 4 required. So rather than abandon years of planning and training and money already spent, the other group reluctantly agreed to officially team up with Joe's group. With that, park officials granted the application, stipulating that they'd need to carry radios, the more experienced members needed to supervise less experienced members, and Joe would need to personally train his team on Mount Rainier prior to their attempt at Denali. Specifically, they'd need to practice crevasse rescue techniques for the glaciers they'd be crossing along the way. And provided they followed through on all those stipulations, they were officially allowed to climb Mount Denali. A few weeks later, at the end of June, the team was in Alaska, fully loaded with gear and ready to begin their ascent. The route they'd be taking was from the north across the Muldrow Glacier first, then up Karstens Ridge. The standard these days is from the opposite direction from the southwest across something known as the West Buttress route, after being dropped off by plane on the Kehultna Glacier. However, at the time, the Karstens Ridge route was more commonly used, in addition to being slightly cheaper because it wouldn't require the additional cost of the plane dropping them in. The trade-off is that because the approach is from the opposite direction, it's more remote. From where the roads end, the group had to trek for 3 days across mosquito-infested tundra until finally setting up Camp 1 at
They have to do that before even starting. Jesus, man.
McGonigal Pass, just before the Muldrow Glacier. Then, on June 22nd, their climb officially began. Another thing about Denali which
Look at this, mate. These sorts of pictures are crazy, man. Maybe it makes it look steeper than it is, but I'm thinking here, you make one wrong step, you're sliding down this entire mountain. Flipping hell.
makes it so difficult is that of the 7 summits, including Everest, Denali is said to require the greatest amount of physical fitness. So to really put that into perspective, despite it lacking the death zone, which Everest has at 8,000 meters, where supplemental oxygen becomes essential, Denali is said to require the greatest amount of physical fitness.
Okay.
Part of the reason for this is that the vertical distance needed to travel is larger, so there's more distance spent ascending. But the main reason is that Denali is so remote and Alaska is so sparsely populated that the help available to climbers is almost non-existent. In contrast, even though Everest is in a remote region of the Himalayas, it's still situated between the two most populous countries on Earth. There's an entire industry of native Sherpas who provide invaluable help in carrying load after load of gear up and down the mountain. Denali has none of this, so instead the loads are carried by the climbers themselves. Like for example, during the first stage of the climb, each person will have an average pack weight of around 70 pounds or 30 kilograms, which on its own would be brutal. But in addition to a heavily loaded backpack, climbers have to pull up to 150 pounds or 70 kilograms worth of gear on a sled behind them.
Oh my days, so they've got over 100 kilograms altogether. So basically carrying a human or two, pretty much.
And all of this is in addition to the large distances traveled while slowly ascending in elevation.
Where's the fun? I know this isn't necessarily supposed to be fun, but like I don't see any excitement in this at all, man. I mean, I understand why they're carrying it because they need the supplies they need. I guess it's just layers and it's for setting up camp and stuff, but man.
On a typical expedition today, the greatest distance traveled by a group in a single day would be around 5.5 miles while ascending about 1,000 feet, while also carrying and pulling all that gear. Obviously, as you ascend and establish camps and eat food, these loads become lighter, but the point remains. The amount of work performed and fitness required by climbers on Denali is almost like nowhere else on Earth. As you ascend as well, this is through and around glaciers, over crevasses, and sometimes deep snow. Then, at the end of a long day of traveling, camp has to be set up, and everyone has to dig, shovel, and cut snow blocks to place tents and other equipment. So that's what these men did, slowly charging their way higher up the mountain. And quite literally, they walked for weeks along the same chunk of flowing ice that is the Muldrow Glacier, constantly on the lookout for deep cracks in the ground that could be the end of the expedition. First, they established Camp 2 along the lower icefall. Camp 3 was set up after that, and before another section known as the Great Icefall at the beginning of July, so close to 2 weeks after they left. Camp 4 was next and was set up below something known as the Harper Icefall at around 12,000 feet on July 4th. This icefall is part of the larger Harper Glacier and is the source of the Muldrow Glacier, which starts near the top of the mountain. It's essentially a massive chunk of flowing ice that slowly makes its way down the mountain under its own immense weight. The section of it known as the icefall is so steep and treacherous that climbers have to ascend a ridge to the side known as Karsten's Ridge because it's almost completely unclimbable. After making this detour around, they set up Camp 5 along the ridge at 15,000 feet on July 13th, now close to a full month from when they started. At this height, they were finally just one camp away from striking distance of the summit. By then, they were all suffering from some degree of altitude sickness, but for the most part, this was minor and everything was going according to plan. That same day that they rested in camp, a weather report came through over the radio and let them know that there was a possibility of a large storm forming, which was projected to hit on the 16th or 17th. But up until that point, weather would be almost perfect for summiting. The team talked about what to do, and eventually Joe suggested that they try to make a push for the summit before the storm had a chance to hit. If they left that day, they could make high camp, then summit the next, and be down before the bad weather rolled in, and with a day to spare. After further conversation, they decided to pack 5 days worth of food and then set up one more intermediate camp at 16,500 feet to spend the night and acclimatize. This would be known as Camp 6 and would hopefully help lessen the effects of altitude sickness. So, toward the end of that day, they made the trek to this camp where they would spend the night. The following day, and for reasons that are sort of unclear, they split into 2 groups, although this may have been due to the worsening condition of some of the less experienced climbers. First was a group of 8 who would head up to High Camp or Camp 7 that day. They would then make an attempt the following day on the 15th. The other 4 would remain at Camp 6 and pack some additional gear and rest before heading up to High Camp the next day. So in the evening of the 14th, that group of 8 established High Camp at 18,000 feet by about 7 p.m. Everything was still going according to plan, and if the weather held, they'd be standing on the massive summit in less than 24 hours. But then the following day, the group splintered further when just 4 of the strongest climbers...
So they're just splitting up more. Oh my days. This is some nightmarish stuff, and I'm assuming there's probably going to be films that are made about this or something, because it's the classic horror film sort of thing. You're splitting up more and more. It's just like, come on, man.
Set out around noon for the summit. This included Joe Wilcox, another member of his party, and then 2 of the climbers from Colorado. This left another 4 at High Camp to wait for the final 4 who would be joining them later. Regardless, that day the weather was perfect. The wind was minimal, sky was clear, and the temperature was just a few degrees below freezing. Because of this, the summit team made great progress and were ascending at a rate of 500 vertical feet an hour with the occasional stop for rest and food. Finally, at 6:30 p.m., they walked across the final narrow ridge leading to the summit and stepped onto the icy top of the highest point on the continent. At the time of this ascent, only around 200 other people could say the same. As they stood on the little plateau, they could see over everything in every direction. There's quite literally nothing higher for thousands of miles in every direction. With the amount of time it had taken for them to reach the top, they wanted to savor their time, and so they spent the next hour and a half wandering the little space, talking on the radios and setting off flares in celebration. Finally, they felt it was time to descend and started down the mountain at around 8 p.m.
God, look at this picture. Oh my days.
As far north as Denali is, the sunset in July is around midnight, so they had plenty of light left to descend by. Even still, it was just a 2-hour walk back down before they stepped into high camp once again. Right around when the summit team returned to high camp, the remaining group from Camp 6 arrived at high camp, so now all 12 of the team members were at 18,000 feet. They all congratulated each other and talked about how the conditions were and what to expect. The plan at this point was still for the remaining 8 team members to summit the following day on July 16th. But when everyone woke up that morning, the wind had picked up and was getting progressively worse. Gusts were already up to 70 miles an hour. So instead of summiting that day, they were all forced to hunker down in their tents and wait for the weather to clear. The renewed confidence they had briefly from the summit the day prior was worn down as they spent the day struggling to prepare food and shoveling snowdrifts that accumulated on their tents. With just 2 stoves for a total of 12 men, some of them just didn't eat so that they wouldn't have to walk between the tents and collect supplies in the wind. This was also partially aided by the nausea that some of them had due to the altitude sickness. At least a few of the party were already having a hard time keeping food down as it was. As the bad weather wore on, some of the less experienced climbers talked about not summiting after all, instead descending as soon as the weather cleared. After coming so far, the combination of conditions and exhaustion had almost drained them of any of their remaining spirit.
I bet.
But luckily again, the next day they woke up to the sound of nothing.
So I'm seeing it. It's looking a bit like a. Like I can see where it could go wrong, but it's not looking like a disaster at this point because they're all still together. They're about to ascend. I guess the weather was better. What he's about to say now. I don't really know where it's going to go wrong. Is the weather going to just hit again or something?
Instead of the violent flapping of their tents from the day before. After eating and talking it over, 7 of the 8 men decided they still wanted to make a push for the summit.
Damn. So one of them's like, nah, I'm good here. Maybe he made the right decision. I mean, we'll see.
Their party, a man named Ancho, was just too sick to continue and would descend with the 4 men who had already summited.
Oh, fair enough.
At around noon, that group of 5 had finished packing all their gear and set off from high camp en route to Camp 6. As they made their way down the icy slopes, they occasionally looked back up to check on the progress of the others, and weirdly, still by 2 p.m., they saw movement in the tents. This was later than they'd discussed, and considering that they had some of the weaker climbers in that group, just generally not a great idea to be leaving so late. In any case, the group did finally set off, but only with 6 members instead of 7.
What?
At the last minute, another climber decided he was too sick to make the trek and would wait for them in camp.
Mate.
A few hours into their summit push, another storm started to form on the upper sections of the mountain. This was the first glimpse of not just any ordinary storm. Another reason why Denali is considered uniquely challenging is the ferocity of the storms that can develop on it. That same feature, which makes Denali so impressive visually, is responsible for creating some truly horrific conditions. When a weather system approaches from the Pacific to the south, rather than a gradual rise up a series of ascending peaks, it essentially slams into the full height of Denali. Like a large boulder sticking out of the river, wind and clouds flow roughly over and around the mountain. In addition to that, it's situated far closer to large bodies of water than Everest, for example, and right in the path of the polar jet stream. This current constantly brings weather systems from the south and right over Denali. And finally, it's also the farthest north of any of the 7 summits, at just 3 degrees of latitude below the Arctic Circle, which can cause some extreme changes in temperature on top of everything else. At the worst of times, the storms in Denali are some of the worst on the planet. Sometime that evening, a radio transmission came in from the summit party and said that they were still somewhere on the upper slopes, but that they didn't know where because they were in fog and whiteout conditions.
God damn.
Instead, they said they were going to bivouac for the night and hope for better conditions in the morning. And for those of you who aren't aware, bivouacking is typically sleeping outside in just a sleeping bag rather than a tent. Incredibly, the next transmission they sent out was at 11:30 a.m. the following morning when they were standing on the summit. Weather still wasn't great, and the winds were higher than they'd like, with poor
Oh, so it went well. I mean, they survived the night.
visibility, but they'd made it. To top it off, the temperature was a relatively warm 6 Fahrenheit or -14 Celsius. The only problem was that of the 6 that left the day prior, only 5 were in the group now. A man named John Russell was unaccounted for since the night before, and it was assumed that he'd headed back down to high camp in the storm, but in all honesty, no one knew if this was actually the case. This should have been far more alarming than it was, but there wasn't much they could do other than descend and hope he was there. The final transmission they sent said that they intended to leave in a few minutes and then they'd radio once they were back at high camp. Unfortunately, shortly after that last call, the storm got dramatically worse and it was the last time anyone ever heard from them.
Jesus, man.
As they descended, a low pressure area from the north, which brought moisture and humidity, met with a high pressure system from the south and created a storm directly over the mountain. At the time, winds were estimated to be up to 150 miles an hour or 240
With the snow, oh my god, mate, that is a horror show.
kilometers an hour, which on its own would be insane enough. This would have made it almost impossible to walk along the narrow ridge lines with all their fresh tracks being erased as they went. However, later modeling showed that near the summit, winds could have been up to 300 miles per hour or
Jesus.
480 kilometers an hour.
Oh my days.
Take these with a bit of a grain of salt since they weren't directly measured, and because if this was true, this would shatter the wind speed records on Earth. Either way, this storm is said to have been the worst experienced by any mountaineers on any mountain in the history of mountaineering. To go along with those brutal winds, temperatures dropped to as low as 30 degrees below zero. This would have made their situation completely hopeless. They wouldn't have been able to walk, let alone see in those conditions, and depending on how exposed they were on the route, they might have been struggling to even stay on the mountain. It's thought that they may have tried to bivouac about 1,000 feet from the summit, but this would have offered them no shelter from the storms. And horrifyingly, this storm would last for 4 days except for a few small breaks. Even for the men at Camp 5, all they could do was wait and hope for a break in the storm to descend. The day that the second group summited was the 18th. The following day on the 19th, the storm was far too bad for anything but hunkering down in the tents and trying to survive. On the 20th, 3 of the strongest climbers from the lower group tried to go back up to high camp and find the men, but it would take them 4 hours to travel just a half mile.
God, they're splitting up even more, mate.
The conditions were still whiteout and a fresh foot of snow had fallen, completely covering their tracks. When they were eventually forced to turn around, even their new tracks from that day still were completely erased. At midday, there was a brief break in the storm for a couple of hours, and the lower group was able to get a clear view up the mountain and the route that the upper group might have taken. But despite scanning the mountainside for a long time, there was no sign of anything. No trail, no people, no tents, and no radio transmissions would come in. It was at this point that they realized that the situation was desperate and sent an emergency radio transmission to the park ranger station. And then soon enough, the storm set in again and would continue to rage as violently as it had before. They spent the rest of the 20th and then the 21st huddled together in 2 tents. Eventually, it became so severe that all 5 men were forced into a little 3-person tent to try to stay warm. Even still, all of their clothes were soaked and they could barely eat, drink, and sleep that night or the night of the 22nd. Then, by the morning of the 23rd, they knew that they couldn't wait in camp anymore. If they stayed any longer, they risked dying of hypothermia themselves, so at the first sign of a break in the weather, they set down from 15,000 feet. About midway across Karstens Ridge, they were met by members of the Mountaineering Club of Alaska who brought hot drinks and dry clothing. One of these members then accompanied them.
What about this person? We're going to find out, I guess. God damn, we have no idea at this point. Flipping out.
Down as the rest of the club members continued higher in search of the missing. Finally, after over a month on Denali, they walked back into base camp on July 25th. Joe Wilcox took it upon himself to travel from there to Wonder Lake to alert the ranger station and request a helicopter to pick up the others. Although they were exhausted and crushed by the loss of the rest of the party, they managed to escape relatively unscathed. Meanwhile, the storm continued to rage on until finally coming to an end on the 28th, 3 days later.
Wow.
The Mountaineering Club members were finally able to travel higher up and find what remained of high camp. In it, they found the tents had been completely destroyed, the gear strewn all over the place, and there was a climber who was frozen to death gripping onto a tent pole. Sadly, the remains couldn't be identified because of the poor condition of the body. The following day, they retraced the route the group had taken and found 2 more bodies at the base of an area known as Archdeacon's Tower. They were found frozen upright and in a position which seemed to indicate they were bracing against the wind. Again, the bodies were badly frozen and were in too bad a shape to be identified. Those were the last to be found. The final 4 members of the group were somewhere on the mountain, buried or fallen into somewhere unreachable. It's even thought that the speed of the wind might have been so strong that they could have been, quite literally, blown off of Denali. In an attempt to get closure for the families, a year later in 1968, a humanitarian effort was organized to try to find and retrieve them, but unfortunately by then, even less remained. Not a single trace of any of them was ever found. At the time, and maybe still currently, the 1967 Mount Denali disaster was considered to be the worst in American mountaineering history. And with the gravity of the disaster, pretty quickly there was controversy about who was to blame. Naturally, outside observers looked to the leaders of the expedition, including Joe Wilcox as the person responsible. This was only made more confusing when the surviving members started publishing books about their accounts of the events, which often conflicted with one another. Since then, at various points in time, different members have been thought to be responsible. It was only later, once the weather was modeled and the true ferocity of the storm was determined, that it absolved any of them of responsibility, on the grounds that no one, not even with modern weatherproofing equipment, could have survived what was occurring on the upper slopes.
I mean, that is the worst situation you could possibly be in. I bet the guy who didn't go never expected a car crash to save his life. Yeah, I mean, thank God for that, man. 150 mile per hour winds is a Category 4 hurricane. 300 mile per hour is an F5 tornado. I don't think anyone would be left on the slopes if the winds reach that high. Yeah, and then you consider the cold and the snow. It probably wouldn't be possible. Why did they try to blame someone for this? It's not a equipment failure issue. These guys decided to climb up the most difficult mountain on Earth when it was announced that a storm was imminent, and they were given a choice, and 6 of them decided to proceed. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I guess you sort of live and die by your decisions, right? And I guess in this case, sadly, people lived and died by their decisions. But god damn, man. Mountain climbing, it's not for me. Obviously, people have different interests, right? Some people may look at this and be like, oh, I would love to do this after seeing this video and this reaction. But, yeah, I'm happy not to do this sort of stuff. But it goes to show, man, like, you just got to be careful. I mean, I guess people who are mountain climbing and all this sort of stuff, mountaineering, should I say, they know there's risks to it. But just the splitting up stuff, like, if they didn't split up or they all went together in the first place, I'm sure they would have all made it. It's a horrible situation, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Until next time, let's subscribe. Peace.